an important part of any budget is saving for future needs, future goals. And that's where investing comes into play. So we started to talk a little bit about investing last week, and how the biblical perspective on building wealth is that the wise person works diligently, plans ahead for future needs, saves little by little, not trying to get rich quick, not trying to blow things out of the water. More like a lot of times the world's mentality around this is a little bit more gambling oriented, I would say, than wisely planning for the future and saving bit by bit for a long time. So in thinking about how to save and invest, I advise what we call a sequential investing strategy. Basically, you start with step one and you move your way this way. So step one on this is eliminating all high interest and short-term debt. So that would be credit card, maybe like a car loan, other things like that that's on the shorter term, basically everything besides the mortgage. That really is saving. It doesn't sometimes feel like it, but it's actually saving with the guaranteed rate of return. You're paying down debt because you're going to get a return that is the interest rate of the debt. The next step after that's done is keeping 1 month's worth of living expenses in a checking account. So if your living expenses are $5,000 a month, then $5,000 in a checking account, sort of as a baseline at all times. Third step is 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses in a high yield savings account, money market fund, something these days should be paying around 4%, if that's going to fluctuate with what's going on in the economy. Step 4, saving for major purchases. This would be like a new car, maybe a down payment on a house, some more expensive furniture items, something like that. After you've got your 3 to 6 months, we call emergency fund in the industry, then you're saving up for some larger expense like that. Something like a new car, I would certainly recommend saving up for that, unless you have, if you have a car emergency, obviously, sometimes it's not possible, but saving up for that so that you don't have to take out a loan, that sort of thing. Step 5 is long-term goals, retirement, college tuition for kids or grandkids, maybe a wedding for a daughter, big dream vacation that's the kind that is going to be pretty pricey, so you need to save up for it, maybe a second home, vacation home, starting your own business even. And then the final step here, once that one is met, is maybe more speculative type of investments. This is money that's a surplus the Lord's given you, and you may be working towards some bigger long-term goals with that money. So really, everyone in this room I know is somewhere on this progression of steps. So and as you move along, as the goals become longer term, become larger, you can take more risk on your investment side because you have a savings buffer for emergency type stuff, and also you have a longer time horizon, so you can weather the short-term volatility. And speaking of time horizon, that's another key element of wise investing, is just awareness of what your time horizon is. Part of the key to having a healthy attitude towards investing is recognizing what your goal is. The purpose of investing is preserving your wealth over time to meet future needs. Those future needs and goals could be maintaining your lifestyle over time, a large one-time purchase, family support, generosity goals, legacy goals, all of those. But it's not, we know as Christians, it's not true that he who dies with the most stuff wins, even though sometimes in our culture that mentality seems to stand out. Of course, that doesn't mean you don't want your portfolio to grow. You do, that's why you're investing it. But you want to connect that growth with goals that go beyond just a portfolio balance for its own sake, right? And the reason I believe that's key to putting money in its proper place in our lives rather than letting it take over. We know that we have a tendency as people to let money take over, and understanding why am I investing? What is my goal here? Why am I trying to grow this rather than just to get a larger number? Is important for not letting it take over. Like I said, lots of different types of goals. You could have a different account for various goals depending on the time horizon, and and what your needs are. We like to think of short-term, intermediate term, and long-term in the industry and in my company in particular as sort of different buckets that are going to have different types of investments in them. Another important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking of investing is your risk tolerance. Usually in the financial industry, risk tolerance, the one that's talked around, it's often associated with the last question listed here, which is, can I sleep well at night if I make these investments? Like how stressed do I get by taking risk? But the time horizon approach, where you're thinking about what you're going to need in the short term, in the intermediate term, and in the long term, and which type of goal it is you're saving up for, that emphasizes the other questions up here, right? When will I need this money? What kind of return do I need? How much risk can I afford? And in investing, I'm sure you guys all know, risk and reward are linked, right? It's kind of a no pain, no gain type of a setup. All investments have some kind of risk. And understanding the different types of risk and taking steps to manage them is going to help you put yourself in a better position. Oftentimes in the industry, you hear the word risk, it's like a synonym for volatility, like we've seen over the last 6 or 8 weeks in US investments. A lot of bumpiness up and down, and people generally talk about risk as the more volatility an investment has, the riskier it is, and also the greater potential for rewards. But I would just caution you to remember there are other kinds of risk. For a short-term need, some money you need within the next year or so, volatility is certainly the greatest risk, because if you have a patch where things go down 10, 20, 30%, all of a sudden your money's not there when you need it. But for long-term needs, inflation is actually the most significant risk, because I think I mentioned last week the cash under your mattress, right? Like that's actually very risky if you're 50 and you need that money in 20 years when you retire, and it's been under your mattress that whole time, it's lost a lot of its buying power, and that's actually a very risky investment, more risky than stocks for your needs in that context. So recognizing that in general volatility and return are going to be over time related, but you can't necessarily tolerate a lot of volatility for something that is that you're going to need soon. So asset allocation, which would be dividing your investment portfolio among different asset categories. That's going to be very personalized depending on your needs and goals, and your age, etc. So stocks, bonds, and cash are generally the most common investments that are used. A lot of times we think of stocks as the long-term investment. That's the money you need in 10, 20 years. Bonds might be the money that you're going to need within the next 3 to 9 years or so. And then cash, that emergency savings account, etc., that would be the money you might need any time. Yes?
I'm curious, on these types of stocks, I've been hearing about like mission-oriented types of stocks and bonds, like if you're a fan of some kind of like green energy or something like that, like what does this fit in there? Or is it just more like, hey, if you've got this piece squared away, then maybe it's time to do some extra with?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different types of investment that can be sort of values-based. It's becoming more and more popular, and I think part of that is just around the technology. It's becoming more and more possible.
Sure.
So there's different ways to incorporate values into investing, and we do a lot with various types. One way that people will sometimes do is potentially invest in, let's say, a Christian company or a Christian fund. In the past, a lot of times that was associated with essentially lower returns, maybe for various reasons, but that's not really quite the case anymore. If you do your due diligence, you can not have to sacrifice return. There's also increasingly technology is available. We work a lot with this where you can very easily take a portfolio, screen out certain maybe types of company that you feel in your conscience you don't want to be involved with. That is increasingly possible, as is actually, we work with a group that does corporate engagement. So on the other hand, you can also own a particular stock, maybe with a company where you have some reservations, but there's an opportunity to have a voice at the meetings, and vote your proxy in such a way that your beliefs are represented in the boardroom. So there's a lot of different ways to do that these days. It's actually really an area of a lot of development in the last couple of years. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
So, and I actually had a note to mention that, but it's
sorry.
partly, so it's perfect timing, but it is partly it can get kind of technically complex. So definitely something I'm, happy to talk with people one-on-one if you have questions about how to do it, but yeah. The other thing that is really key, and I think this one, I run into a lot of situations where this one isn't followed necessarily as much as maybe it should be, is diversification. I see diversification, this verse from Ecclesiastes 11:1-2 saying, this is an interesting metaphorical phrase in the passage talking about casting your bread upon the waters. You may have heard this, but give a portion to 7 or even 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen on the earth. To me, diversification is just an acknowledgement that as stewards, we actually don't know the future. The Lord does, but we do not. And so we need to remain aware that disaster can come where we least expect it. We need to maintain that humility that says, because I don't know what's going to happen, I need to be wise with as much as I do know, but that's going to be limited. So just in terms of stocks, just even limiting to the discussion of stocks, diversification could look like U.S. companies and international companies. The last couple of months in the U.S. have been pretty bumpy on the stock market. Things have kind of recovered, but it's been a bit of a rough ride internationally, especially with exchange rates. International investments have done really great. So if you have a well-diversified portfolio internationally, then things are looking a lot better for you in 2025 than if you're all US. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it might be the other way around. But again, we don't know what's coming, so that's part of the diversification. That could be large, medium, and small companies. That could be growth-oriented companies versus value-priced companies. That could look like just making sure you don't have your investments too concentrated in one industry or one sector. Again, this year, like last year, if you were concentrated in some of the big tech AI type companies, you were doing great. This year, not so much, right? So again, just not knowing what the future holds, we want to diversify with a sense of humility. So I would say, just briefly, wisdom in investing can be summed up as knowing the proper role and goal of your investments, having a thoughtful plan, and sticking to the course. Really quick here, I'm gonna go over to my other slide deck and just mention a couple things around giving.
May I ask you just a quick question
Yeah, of
while
course.
you're navigating? So I've seen a lot in the news kind of questioning the, stock sale, like stocks are down, you should buy more, like buy and hold. And it just seems to me like, again, the news is kind of meant these days almost like generate clicks so if they can generate anxiety.
Yeah.
And so it just seems like every time the stock market goes down, there's these stories about, is the conventional wisdom really true? And then people get out of all their stocks and like realize all their losses. Yeah. Anything to say about like how like investing is reported?
In the news?
Yeah, and the role of anxiety in driving people's investing.
I've been thinking the last couple of months, I'm like, the way that some of the news reporting makes it sound like, this is like the biggest financial crisis in the last 15 or 20 years. And I'm like, what are you guys gonna say when something bad actually happens? Like, you've already used up all your negative language in this little bout of volatility. Like, do we not remember that on average, the stock market goes down between 10 and 15% at some point every year? Like, that is not unusual. But like you say, just trying to stir up the anxiety so they get more clicks, I think is absolutely what's going on. There's tons of statistics out there about how, people who sell it all in a moment of panic, it never works. It's always a bad idea. You always end up with, there's no way to time the market. But when someone is feeling very high anxiety, all those statistics don't help, right? So that's why I really like to emphasize having a plan, knowing what these investments are for, knowing what your timeline is, and then being able to just let that anxiety go because you've planned. You know what the goal for them is, and you know that the funds that you need next year, they're there, you've saved them, they're not in the stock market, so that you're able to just rest easy with those longer term funds. So that's where the planning, the setting your own goals and sticking to the course becomes really key. And then you can just ignore the noise in the news.
Yeah.
It's just less, it's not gonna get you in trouble.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest, one of the ways that I kind of choose my financial news sources is looking for folks that don't have a panic message. Like, I like Morningstar, for example, and they're very much right now, they're like, don't panic, don't sell everything, don't lock in your losses.
Yeah.
If you're following the plan, which Sasha's been talking about, keep following the plan, and especially if you dollar cost average, which is put a certain amount of paycheck every month into the market. Well, when it's down, you're gonna be buying more stock. And so, long term, that's gonna help.
Right. And anyone who has a 401k is already dollar cost averaging. So, just stay the course.
Yeah, and people need to realize we've been through this before.
Well, yeah, like I said,
Because
pretty much every year the
like-
stock market goes down at least 10% at some point.
But like in 2008, we had a big drop.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah,
And-
a lot bigger than
From
anything that's
10,000
happened
to
this
60,000.
year.
And I had
40% of my 401k that year.
a person I worked with that sold everything and put it into, and it's like, no, and I told him not to. but
Yeah.
I did. And I actually took cash and put in and make 25% a year.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you've
You
got
buy low.
Yeah, and the only reason, if someone feels the urgency in a time of volatility to sell everything and put it all in cash, then they weren't invested correctly in the first place. Because if they need that money next year, then it's too late at that point. Like, it's already gone down, and you're not in a great place. So that's again why being aware of the time horizons in advance is so important, so that people don't get stuck in that type of a situation.
And before you go on,
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about your first slide. For somebody like me that's retired, that needs to be modified a little bit.
Sure. Well, yes, and it is interesting because a person in retirement is most likely actually, or at least very often, not saving, right? Because once you're in retirement, potentially living off a portfolio, you're not necessarily, unless, some people have enough surplus that they may still be doing so, but at that point it becomes more about, okay, what do I do with this surplus if you actually have a surplus? Do I give it to church, to family, do I help my kids, my grandkids, all of that, as opposed to saving it for the future, because the future is now once you're retired, right? So it becomes different, for sure.
So like me, I'm on Social Security. That's a fixed income.
Right.
So when I'm doing my 3 to 6 month, it's what do I can add to my Social Security?
Sure. And the 3 to 6 months when you're in retirement is more about, obviously at that point, assumedly you have a fairly substantial savings of some type that you've saved up over the decades of work. In that case, 3 to 6 months becomes more about how much do you want in cash versus bonds and stocks. Because it's still important to have the cash set aside in case there's, we gotta get a new car unexpectedly, or there's a medical emergency and it costs some money or something like that. Then you need to make sure that you do still have the cash available, but it's less about, saving it up and more just making sure it's allocated right.
Well, I have a philosophy of, in my investments, that I will not remove, I'll limit how much I remove so that they are still growing in the future. So I get a pay raise every year.
Yeah, so you've allocated them pretty well then for your needs, it sounds like, so that's good, yeah. Anyone else, I wanna be respectful of time here, and we've got a lot to talk about, but any other questions or comments about investing before you spend just a few minutes on giving? Okay, so just, this is gonna be brief, but I wanna just show a few things about, we talked about why save, right? And that's, and then, because on the 5 uses of money, the saving and the giving are ones often that people see as sort of optional, even though for the wise steward, they're essential. And so that's why I wanted to spend a little bit more time on those, just because there's potentially a little bit more strategic. As far as why giving, there's many reasons stated in the Bible. What are some things that you would think of when you think about why should we give?
It's commanded.
Yep, God commands us, for sure. Anything else?
Good for the heart.
Yeah, I like to, we like to say at my company, our founder has this phrase saying that giving is the only way to break the power of money. Because as we've talked about, money has a tendency to sort of take control over our minds and hearts and our lives, and giving is a way of just breaking that power again and again. So, anything else?
It's an expression of gratitude.
Yeah, gratefulness, because the Lord has been so generous to us. It's just an expression of gratitude for His generosity. Yep.
Can also be an expression of our care for the poor and the needy.
Right, yeah.
After God's heart.
It can very directly help others, yeah. And show God's love to them. Yeah, I know these verses are probably a little bit hard to see. The 1 Corinthians 10:26 is quoting Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. Honor the Lord with your wealth and the first fruits of all your produce. Passage from Deuteronomy, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and the poor in your land, so that goes back to that. And then 1 Timothy 6 verse, this is, I know it's just the phrase in there that stands out, that it says, be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future. So true riches in heaven. Another reason we give, it's we're told we will be rewarded for it, right? That's in the parable of stewards too. So let me see. I'm gonna skip ahead to this slide. Okay, this is again probably quite small, but this, I think there's some really good tips on this slide about developing a giving strategy. If you don't have a strategy, it can be hard to stick to it and hard to do it sometimes. And these are some really good ideas. So the first one just says, what assets do I have to offer? How can I use these effectively to serve others? That doesn't have to be financial, that can be time, that can be giftings or talents that the Lord has given you, as well as financial. Question 2 says, am I giving sacrificially to support God's work? Question 3, am I doing my fair share to support the work of the church, or am I leaving this up to others? I think a lot of times it can be easy for all of us to sort of get in a sense of like, oh, I'm so busy, or I have so many financial obligations, or whatever, like I'll just leave that to people who have more resources, but we all need to participate. Am I seeking to give as much as I can, or do I try to get by with giving just a minimum to the Lord and spending the rest on myself? That's true financially as well as in other areas. How does my giving compare to other items in my budget? Does my giving indicate that God's work is the priority in my life? 6, do I give the way I would want others to give if they were giving to meet my need? That's a convicting question perhaps, but it's a good one. 7, how much should I give regularly versus as the Spirit moves me? This one's kind of an interesting one, we can maybe talk about a little more later, but in Scripture there are many very clear examples of both percentage giving, a regular commitment to give a certain amount, and also Spirit-led giving, sacrificial giving on top of that, where it's a little bit more spur of the moment, a need arises, and it just, a person just jumps in to meet that. So I think both of those are actually pretty important for us to have a regular disciplined habit, and then also be open to the Lord's leading if an opportunity arises that's outside of the regular. Question 8, should I give anonymously? There's no right or wrong answer to that. That's the Lord's leading and contextual, but it's certainly a good question. I've had experiences myself where, on a couple of occasions, where I did an intentionally anonymous, generous gift, and it can be very rewarding, depending on the context. So sometimes that is the best way to go, other times maybe not. And then 9, are there ways I can be more tax efficient in my giving? Always a fun one for financial planners to talk about, but I would just say I don't know if I've ever met a person who wants to give more to the government and less to charity, so there's a lot of tax efficient strategies to shift the balance towards charitable recipient rather than the government. So that's a fun one that I like to help people with. But anyways, that's just a quick overview of some of the questions to consider as you're thinking about giving strategy for yourself and your family. Anyone of those particularly stand out to you or speak to anyone? Hear any thoughts about any of those?
Number 6 was something that Matt and I were talking about. How much should I give regularly versus, sorry.
Number 7?
Do I give the way I want others to give if they were giving to me my need?
Oh, yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, do unto others, shoot.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's kind of an open, maybe an application of the golden rule that we don't always think of. Yeah.
Well, I think 4 as well, and every time I've heard, stewardship talked about, it's more like, you think, I gave my 10%, I'm off the hook.
Yeah.
The rest is mine, and it's like, I remember hearing someone saying that they had started at 10 and they were convicted, not everybody convicted, but to increase it by 1% every year.
Yeah.
And this person was like 70 years old, and they were like, God has not failed us yet, and we're doing it. And it was like, wow. But it was pretty inspiring.
Yeah. No,
to challenge themselves, like instead of saying, I don't really need this money, I won't miss it, to like, I'm going to really look sacrificially and see. I mean, it was just a different level of giving.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's fantastic that person was attuned to the Lord calling them to do that. I mean, we hear people say, you should do this for your retirement savings, right? Like, okay, just start it wherever you can and do 1% increase per year. It's like, well, why not for generosity as well? Anyone else? I have, yes.
I guess the question I have is giving. Well, actually, I'll make a statement instead. Giving isn't just giving to the church.
That's true. Yes, absolutely.
It's lots of various things that we're giving to.
Yeah, for sure.
The one that jumps in my head is that in the Old Testament, farmers were to leave the edges of the fields for the gleaners and the sojourners.
Yeah.
And then give 10% out of what they did harvest.
Yeah, right.
So they were giving way beyond 10%.
Yeah, no, and I skipped it because we don't have time, but I have a slide in here about, a lot of experts who study Old Testament figure the actual required giving percentage was more like 23. Had the tithe and then a couple of others. And another thing that beside the giving to the church, supporting our ministers, that's the purpose of the tithe, but then there's other giving as well. And some of that it may be to family. It may be, in America, because we do have a tax advantage on certain types of giving, I think we get kind of drawn into thinking of that as charitable giving, but there's so many other ways to be generous that maybe aren't a tax deduction or, aren't like a check to the church that maybe seem a little less obvious, but are still part of being generous. Totally agree. Yep. All right, well, I am going to we are going to, Blake asked me to do a quick lightning round on a few topics, and then we're gonna get into a discussion. So.
Yeah, this is Sasha's last week teaching, and she's the expert on this stuff. So, yeah, I'm gonna switch it up a little bit.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So hopefully, hopefully you can roll with the punches. But I feel like we all know Dave Ramsey
Oh, yeah.
pretty
okay.
well, or
Yeah.
like have heard some of his
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So,
Wait, are you like throwing Dave Ramsey questions at me?
yeah. Well, I just want to throw a couple quotes
Just
out
with
there
less
and
insults,
see
okay?
how you would react, because
Okay.
he's such a polarizing figure. So I think
Yeah.
this will be fun.
Keep in mind, this is going to go online.
I know.
Yeah. Blake, if
You might
you're
edit
gonna
it.
ask questions, can you grab the?
Okay, if you live like no one else, later you can live like no one else.
Yeah.
Have you heard him say that? Okay,
Yeah.
what's your take on that?
I mean, so when in the context that he is giving for that is sort of frugality now, so that you've saved up sufficiently for your future, right? So that instead of, and yeah, we've heard it, you know, like if you like, don't live like all your friends now, so that you know all your friends aren't living like you later,
Yeah.
like that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some wisdom to it in that strategically thinking ahead to future goals often means denying certain wants right now. So I think there's some wisdom to it. It has to be balanced towards current goal, balanced around current goals as well, though, right? Because you've got in the present, you also may have family needs. You have giving goals, all those things now. So I think people can take it to extremes and you know go into an extremely extreme frugality mode right now, and then again, we don't know the future. We have to plan as wisely as we can for what we do know, but future's uncertain.
Yeah. Debt sucks.
I would say the Bible cautions us against the use of debt. It says the borrower is slave to the lender, which we know that's true. I mean, if you are obligated to pay a loan back, that has to be priority one in some ways, because it's a legal obligation, it's a moral obligation, and so getting under that sort of servitude is potentially unwise. I think the key thing I would say about the use of debt is if you do decide to use debt, I would always caution against short-term, high-interest type debt, just so expensive. But you know, a longer-term debt, for example, something like a home, and probably the most common type of debt that people would take on. The key is to have a reasonable and strategic plan for paying it back. So with a home, if all else fails, you have the house itself, you have the asset. If you've been at least somewhat wise in the way you structured the loan and the down payment and all of that, if everything else falls apart, you still have a plan to pay it back because you can sell the house and pay it back, right? Whereas even with a car, that one becomes a little bit more of a gray area, because you know, I'm sure you guys all know, when you drive a car off the lot, it depreciates automatically. So you may not be able to, you may not have, if you took on a big loan, you may not actually have a reasonable plan for paying that back. But I think there's always a certain level on which debt presumes on the future. And that's why we have to be cautious, because we don't know what the future holds. And if we make assumptions about our ability to pay it off later, we might get ourselves in trouble. So I would say I very much caution people against the use of debt. Debt's not a sin. The Bible never says that. It does say, be careful with this, and you have to pay what you owe.
But you're not advising like a 15-year mortgage over a 30-year. I think Dave kind of
Just to get it paid off.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you can afford it, that's great. Around here, that's I mean, just like on a cash flow level, right? I mean, I certainly, I think it's great to pay it off faster than required, you know, pay it down. Again, it's even if your interest rate is 4%, let's say, you put extra money against that, you're getting a guaranteed 4% rate of return. You can't really get that anywhere else. So, you know, I advise paying it down fast, but
Cool. Any other Dave Ramsey fans out there want to?
Well, you haven't said the word stupid in there anywhere.
I haven't really watched him very much, but I'm getting the impression he likes to insult people.
He does.
Zooming on the
Yeah.
future, can I say, like, I've had patients who were saving for retirement, planning on the sacrifice now, and I'm going to enjoy it, I'm going to travel, and then they had a major health issue.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
then they couldn't travel.
For
I had
sure.
one person tell me that they no longer felt motivated to travel. So I do think that's kind of presuming on the future too.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to be healthy, I'm
Yes.
going to have means, I'm going to,
Yeah,
and so I don't know if necessarily like deferring, enjoying what God has given is wise either. I
I totally agree. There's such a balance to be had, and it's tricky. I mean, and this is the thing I always come back to with my clients, and just in general, it's the most interesting and tricky thing about this field, I would say, is that we don't know the future. And I think people do act like they do too often, and that's another example of that, right? We don't know what the future holds as far as our health. So there has to be a balance between investing in your family now, for example, in enjoying God's good gifts now, versus planning for the future. I mean, we always plan on the financial planning side for our clients to live to 100 because more and more people are doing it these days, and you want to be conservative, but at the same time, we're not guaranteed tomorrow. So it's a tricky balance, and it's not just financial numbers balance, it's a mindset balance too. And it has to all come back to that sense of humility.
Yeah, I really like those points. The other thing is, personally, I kind of look at insurance expenses as an investment expense. Like primarily, if you're a primary breadwinner, make sure you got life insurance covered because we don't know the future.
Yeah.
And for people that are higher net worth, look at your liability insurance because there's things that can happen.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
medical insurance.
Yeah, all of that, yeah, for sure. No, I mean, the life insurance piece is an important one because I think that I've certainly known people who, kind of figured, I've got all the time in the world to figure that out, and then there's a diagnosis, and they're in their 40s, and all of a sudden, it's too late to figure that out.
And it doesn't take much.
No, and then obviously you can't get a policy after that, something like that happens, so, yeah, it's key.
You mentioned one of the values of your company were that giving diminishes the power that money has on us. I was curious, just your thoughts around being more vulnerable in discussing our finances. And
Yeah.
your thoughts there.
No, I
think besides giving,
Yeah.
the more we can talk about this topic, like the less hold it has.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's tricky. Obviously, it's a tricky topic to discuss, partly just because of that element, like in the parable of the talents, where everyone is entrusted with a different amount, right? And that can be uncomfortable to talk about. But I do think that openness, as opposed to sort of secretiveness, is an important element in just diminishing the power that it has. Of course, being as we're flawed human beings, openness can turn into sort of bragging, and it can go down all sorts of unhealthy paths, obviously. But a healthy openness, I think, is really key. I agree with that. I mean, I'm used to it because I talk about it every single day. So like I've gotten to the point where, I probably have had plenty of conversations with friends where I shared, just kind of casually shared like information about my own finances that they're kind of like, whoa, like, I don't talk about that. Just like I don't even think of it because I'm so used to it because it's what I do all day, every day. But yeah, no, I do think it's healthy to be open, for sure.
I saw on your previous slide, just talking about anonymous giving. Any thoughts on anonymity and, because like even with the transparency thing, like knowing how people are giving or what they're giving, because we're all called to give.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, sometimes for practical purposes, it can be, I know I have some clients who, if they make a large gift, they want it to be anonymous just because they don't want the ministry to then be like sending them 20 mailers a year asking for more money, because they're like, hey, I didn't want you to spend it on that. So sometimes even just a practical level, anonymity can be helpful for that. I had, like, I referenced one time when I did a large anonymous gift, it was, someone that was in need that I knew, and I didn't want them to know who it came from because, that just felt inappropriate. I wanted it to be just an anonymous blessing, you know, so there can be contexts like that, I think, where it can be, beneficial. As far as the recipient knowing who it came from, I don't know that, I mean, I like to share about not necessarily amounts, but I like to share about the ministries that I support just because I am passionate about those. I want people to know what they're doing and the good work that they're doing, and so I like to talk about that just in terms of where I'm giving, but I don't know that I would share amounts with others.
Well, there's a question too, of like getting your reward now and getting it later. I mean, the school my kids go to has an auction every year, like a charity auction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I remember my wife and I went one time and they had us like raise the paddle, like to give certain amounts.
Yeah.
And I remember like the moment was coming, he said, hey, we're gonna do that. And it was like, I just wanna like give a check and like not, it just felt like, look at me. You know, and it just didn't feel right.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if somehow, like that would be another way to like do it anonymously, like I don't want, you're calling attention to yourself
Sure.
that you're giving.
Yeah.
It's not really an inspiration to others, it's more like an ego stroke, and I think you gotta be careful about that too.
No, that's a good point, and I do think it's, you know, the give anonymously versus not thing is also that's also a matter of personal conscience, and in a context like that, you know, my, like sort of mental emotional response in a context like that is actually to be inspired and motivated by like, wow, look, all these people, they love, because I used to be a teacher and I still go to that school auction every year too, so I know the context exactly that you're talking about. And when that happens, when that period comes up in that auction, I always just really enjoy, and it's not that I'm not like there to like show off the amount I'm giving. I just get motivated and excited by seeing, you know, look at this room of like 200 people and they're all raising their paddles and, you know, giving large amounts, and it's inspiring that, wow, there's so many people who really care about this cause and really support this thing that I'm passionate about as well, which is Christian education. And so to me, that's invigorating. I don't look over and be like, oh wow, that person must be so rich. Look, they just gave 5,000. You know, it's not the way I experience it, but everyone's going to be different. So I totally respect what you're saying as well. Like, I think everybody experiences that differently.
Yeah.
How do you determine like how much you give routinely and then one-off giving?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think I hesitate to mention like, I don't want to say that a specific number or percent is right or wrong for, you know, I think that's between each person and the Lord. I do think we all need to listen to him about it and seek his the guidance of the Spirit. But I do think that having a set amount that you give regularly, whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage amount to certain ministries, is scriptural. That seems pretty clear. And then I like to think of the spontaneous giving as sort of, you know, in excess of whatever you feel the Lord's called you to in general. So if you're doing 10%, for example, maybe, you know, to splitting it between church and a couple of ministries that you care about, and then you get an opportunity to give above and beyond that and you feel the Lord's calling you to it, then that would be in addition to the 10%. Sort of a free will offering, if you will, to use a biblical term for it. But I think the best way to approach it is the regular amount, have that be whatever percentage or dollar amount you feel the Lord's calling you to, and have that just be a regular part of your practice of daily living, and then just be open to what he's calling you to and above and beyond that.
I think one way to think about too is just when you get like a bonus or you get a gift, like a monetary gift from a family member, and you're like, I don't really need anything right now.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's like an opportunity to be like, okay, I could look around and see where I could just
Yeah.
gifts instead of just.
Yeah. No, I love that. When I mean, for myself, I have 2 bonuses a year, and it's always like, that is actually an exciting time because I'm like, oh, I've got some extra, like, where am I, and I do actually try to, just have an openness to like where the Lord would lead me to write a larger check than normal. And it is somewhere different that I don't, support on a monthly basis. It's more like, oh, this is an opportunity, like something comes up, a cause comes up. I learned some information about what a ministry that I like to support occasionally is doing, and I'm like, oh, I'm trying to send them a check. So I try to be open on that, and it is fun. I actually enjoy it. Mm-hmm.
Where I struggle in giving is, well, the Old Testament and New Testament both talk about taking care of the poor and the widows, and doing that in a responsible way is probably one of the hardest things to do that I've ever found.
Just be in terms of which ministries are doing it in a responsible way.
Giving money to them directly through an organization.
Yeah.
When you give it directly, that's a tough one.
Yeah, no, that's true. It is. That is tricky, and it does take a lot of discernment to figure out how best to do that.
Yeah, we're commanded to do it.
Yeah, right. It's not optional. Yeah, I mean, there, like this is one example. Obviously, we have deacons ministry through our church, and I appreciate that type of ministry because I feel a certain level of trust that that's going to be used responsibly. I don't have to go figure out exactly, who needs support and how to use those funds myself. But I can delegate that to people that I trust in this church and know that they're going to be doing their very best. And I appreciate that personally. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I struggle with the same thing, Charles. And what my family's decided on is there's a couple ministries like Seattle Union Gospel Mission, Everett Union Gospel Mission that are, they're very explicitly Christian based. They kind of treat the whole person with spiritual aspects. And they have the expertise for everything from, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. So they've got all those services. So there are organizations out there that are very scripturally based that could be a vehicle for you to choose to direct your giving. Because I'm also uncomfortable just handing somebody on the street cash for all those reasons.
Or even somebody you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I know Chad had a burning question over here.
Well, sorry too, but it's on a different subject, so do we want to?
Yes, yeah.
The first one is regarding the comments earlier about paying down debt faster. Especially very low interest debt. So like I had a 2% school loan and a 0.9% car loan.
Yeah.
And I was paying those as slowly as I possibly could
Yeah.
because like their inflation is typically faster than that. So
Right.
am I thinking through that correctly? Or
Yeah. Yes.
Dave says no. What do you say?
Yeah. So I'll have, I tend to, on a question like that, which, essentially comes down to, should I pay off my very low interest rate loan faster than required? In the context of financial planning, a lot of times there's ways to make an assessment of, essentially like how does that actually affect your financial future. But when it comes down to it, I usually tell clients that they need to follow their conscience on that. The secular financial planner is going to say, no, don't pay that down. Like, for sure, invest that somewhere else where you can make at least 4%. Like, that's silly to pay down a 1% loan. And from a purely numbers-based approach, that is true. However, I think there's also conscience elements to how comfortable you are with having debt, period, even if it's very low interest. And I want to defer to a person's conscience in that area.
Gotcha.
So that's what I would generally say when someone asks me about that. I say, well, the numbers would say probably, yeah, don't pay that down fast.
Yeah.
But how comfortable are you owing that money? Because you are obligated, to the lender. You're not free to do whatever you want with your money because you have to pay that down. So for some people, that makes them uncomfortable enough that they just want to get rid of it. Who cares what the interest rate is? And I can respect that. So yeah, that's what I generally say. It's a good question.
Somebody from Ron Blue, actually, I asked that question a
Oh, yeah?
while ago, and what their question back was, would you take out a loan for that amount to invest in something else? And if you wouldn't take out a 0.9 or a 2% loan to invest, you should pay off the debt. Because essentially that's what you're doing, is you're taking that money like almost like a loan and using it versus like paying it off. That was their perspective. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Yeah, I mean, on some level, I guess, if you take out the loan, then, well, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a decent way of thinking about it. But I wouldn't want to pressure people to either pay it off or not pay it off.
Mhm.
I think that's up to the conscience. What was your other question?
The other question was the cash in the money market account versus the stocks and bonds. Like, I don't quite understand the advantage of that as opposed to just pulling money out of the stocks and bonds when you need it. Like having the 3-month emergency fund.
Oh, yeah.
Because
yeah,
like in the
yeah.
long, you never know when you're gonna need to access that.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, it seems like it's not making as much as it could in the stocks and bonds. And you can usually get access to the money within a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason that I recommend having the emergency fund in cash is just because of the volatility. The reason you have the emergency fund is because you don't know when you're going to need it. Hopefully you never need it and it just kind of sits there. But, eventually something's going to break around the house. You'll need to get a new car or car repair or whatever. Eventually, some way or another, you're very likely to need it. And you just want to ensure that it's there for you when you need it. If you need it on, the first week of April this year and everything's down 15%, or depending on what you're in, maybe even more, then that is not a good feeling because now you have a lot less money and you're having to sell it at a lower price, take it out. Bonds are less volatile than stocks, but they can still be, in 2022, they went down a lot, like historically a lot, like 10% plus. So you don't want to find yourself having to draw on those at a time when it's really not ideal to sell. So that's why the cash, I would always say make sure it's in something high yield. If you're not earning at least 3.5% on it right now, it's not in a good spot. So at that point it is keeping up with inflation. So it's maintaining its buying power there for you. But if you need to draw on it, you don't have to worry about, oh no, is it a bad time to sell? You just go draw on it. Does that make sense?
Kind of, but
Kinda.
I'm not sold on that
Yeah,
logic. It's just as likely to be a good time to sell.
Is that just increasing your exposure to risk? Right? It's just
Yeah.
going further along the risk reward. So if you have a very high risk tolerance, then you could not have any real emergency fund, just put it all
Well,
in
if you
stocks.
have, that's if you have a very high risk tolerance emotionally, but the emotional risk tolerance is different from the practical risk tolerance. You are still risking needing it when it's not there. So I would say that's, wise stewardship would indicate you plan for the near future unknown, you have reserve. And the amount of the reserve is going to depend on what your income is, whether you're married, what your life circumstances are, 1 or 2 incomes, and what, do you have kids that depend on you, all of that kind of stuff. It's flexible. And some people are comfortable with less of an emergency reserve, and others, some people want hundreds of thousands of cash that they don't really need, and then it's more of a trying to help them get more comfortable with taking a little bit more risk. But it's not just about your emotional risk tolerance, it's also about your needs. So that would be my advice. Obviously people can do what they want with their own funds. I'm not going to ever force anyone to do anything that they're not comfortable with, but yes.
I want to go back to his previous question. I've heard
Debt?
many people say, well, it's such a low interest loan, I don't need to pay it off fast. But they don't save the money they would have paid to pay it off fast. So you need to, if you're not going to pay it off fast, then at least take that money and invest it
As opposed to just spending it on current lifestyle.
instead of spending on lifestyle.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because I think a current lifestyle that's essentially enabled by a bunch of debt is probably not wise. Because again, you're kind of presuming on the future that the inflows are always gonna be the same as they are now, so I'm just gonna keep on living like I can right now, and that's not necessarily a wise approach. Yeah.
I think we're at time. So thank you so much, Sasha, for leading these sessions. I have a whole list of topics. 529s for Christian education, stock-based giving, donor advised funds, qualified charitable distributions. If any of those sound interesting to you, talk to Sasha after. She would love to talk to you. But yeah, thank you so much.